This is Dr. Karen, and you are listening to the Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network, where I share up-to-date, evidence-based practices, my own experiences, and guest interviews designed to help pediatric therapists, educators, and aspiring school leaders design services that support social, emotional, and academic growth and set kids up for success in adulthood. Whether you want to learn effective strategies for your therapy session or classroom, be an influential leader on your team, or find creative ways to use your skills to advance in your career, I've got you covered. Hey everybody, it's Dr. Karen, and welcome to episode 172 of the De Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network. How can districts reverse chronic absenteeism and gain a deeper understanding of why students don't come to school? Can we measure how connected students are to their schools? And how do we impact the level of connection they feel with potential mentors in their lives? I invited Jen Perry to this episode of De Facto Leaders to discuss this topic and explore ways schools can assess student engagement and put meaningful programs in place to increase it. Jen joined Edmentum as the learning designer for social emotional learning after she spent over 30 years working in educational and community settings with youth. She has been a teacher, an administrator, and a trainer. She has a passion to help educators understand social emotional learning and trauma-informed systems. And she's worked in a number of settings supporting youth, administrators, and schools, and really helping them understand behavior. In this conversation, we discussed using positive youth development models and how to support youth involved with the legal system, changing our assumptions about kids who have risk factors and kids who have resources, helping youth build developmental assets through community navigation and academic support, as well as some of the research on the effectiveness of high-impact tutoring in increasing attendance and student engagement. We also discussed how we can help kids connect academic work to meaningful life goals and giving students the language they need for self-advocacy and self-awareness. Be sure to check the show notes for all the links to some of the resources that we shared in this conversation, as well as where you can go to connect with Jen. And also, many of the topics that we discussed are relevant to some of the things that you'd want to consider when you're thinking about executive functioning. So definitely, if you are in a position where you are providing support for students who need support in the area of executive functioning, be sure to check out the School of Clinical Leadership, my program that helps related service providers develop a strategic plan for putting executive functioning support in place in collaboration with their school teams. To learn more about the program, you can go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. Now, please enjoy this conversation with Jen Perry. Today, I am joined by Jen Perry, the Senior Manager of Learning Design from Edmentum. So thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited.
Yeah, so you have such an interesting background and you've done so much amazing work. So I'd love to have you start by just sharing who you are and what you do, and maybe just a little bit about your background that brought you here.
Awesome. Well, sure. I've been in the education world for 35 years in really different ways. I started in juvenile justice, and I spent about half of my career in elite boarding school situations as a teacher and a coach and a dorm head. And then I bumped back into the world of what some people call youth at risk. I call youth at promise. So basically kids who have trouble regulating their own behavior and their families for a multitude of reasons. And that spanned supporting a K through 12 school, that was residential for both behavioral and mental health needs. And then right before I made the jump to Edmentum, I was the director of Reinvesting in Youth, which was a juvenile diversion program in the city of Rochester, New York. And we worked with community-based organizations, school districts, and probation, and I ran 2 non-secure detention facilities. So you say like, okay, after all that, how do you end up in an ed tech place?
Yeah.
Right? Like,
Yeah.
so really interesting. And who would have thought? But in 2018, 2019, Edmentum was looking at how to create a story around the whole learner and really think about what does engagement look like? What does it look like to have education that meets the needs of a whole child? How do we define that? And so they created a position in learning design. And subsequently, I'm now the senior manager of learning design, and I work on how we build curriculum, how we support implementation, because we believe that, digital curriculum is always teacher full, and we need to be educator first in our approach. So we look at how do we support creating the space for teachers to be their best selves and for districts to get what they need. And so I look at that from the pedagogical design perspective and the sort of whole learner lens. And so I've been at Edmentum since 2019, which was honestly, a lovely shift after
Yeah.
80-hour days and COVID friendly. So it's just been a fabulous evolution. Yeah.
And you focus specifically on social emotional learning. Is that, or do you do other types of curriculum as well in your
Yeah,
position?
so at one point, Edmentum had a social and emotional learning curriculum. Really, as we looked at the evolution of the whole learner, the best way to meet the needs of a learner is through integrated curriculum. So I actually look at all of our curriculum. I work with all aspects
Mhm.
of that and think about the ways that we the tone in which we deliver things, whether we've scaffolded right, are we meeting the needs of diverse learners, right? So when we think about social and emotional learning, we often pigeonhole it into a sort of very specific category, but
Yeah.
really this idea of integrated whole brain learning is about the way the brain works. And so it's how do we create meaning in learning that makes learning sticky
Hmm.
for kids in a multitude of ways that increase engagement and in turn increase things like connection and attendance. And so I get to look at everything. And
That makes,
yeah, go ahead.
no, I was going to say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense because I think that with, and some of the things that my listeners might be working through is the idea of, kids who need special ed services and how do we handle the social skills group, which somewhat falls under that category of social emotional learning, but you can't think of social emotional learning as a class or a social skills group. It's got to be across all the other areas because it has to be applied to all of them. So I think that sometimes, like you said, the pigeonholing of it's not a class, it's something that happens
Right.
in all the classes.
So it's really interesting. Absolutely. So I had this experience of 9 years of being in a school that was K through 12, that was all IEP driven. All the kids were there, not because it was the best education in the world, although we did a great job, but it was because they couldn't regulate their behavior. So you can't really sort of say, well, we're going to do an hour of social skills and then we're going to teach you math and
Yeah.
not still work on, how am I keeping a kid engaged and focused and managing behavior. And we all know that we don't always have the skills to do that. And the other thing that I learned across the sort of spectrum of experience, right, is and it's actually one of the really positive takeaways from COVID is we used to think about needs that we categorize as social emotional as those kids, those
Hmm.
people, right? But really, when you work in a diversity of settings, you realize that it's everyone. And in COVID, we learned it's everyone. It's teachers,
Hmm.
it's adults, it's kids, it's we all after like when I started more than 30 years ago, and you know this experience, like you were expected to leave your emotions at the door and show up for
Yeah.
work. But
Mm-hmm.
we know actually, because we can map the brain, that your brain does not work that way. So you're asking someone to do something that's like contra indicated. And so
Yeah.
anybody who's experiencing emotion, that is, as Mary Helen Immordino Yang says, the rudder that steers thinking. And so you're going to be engaged or disengaged based on, where you are in terms of your basic needs and your emotional life, and better for worse in terms of your learning based on that.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I had a couple questions before I know you have some research that we wanted to talk about attendance and engagement and
Sure.
keeping kids connected at school, but just this concept of the assumptions that you make about kids based on their families, like, well, this child is in this type of setting, so they're not okay, or this child has resources, so they must be fine. And just thinking about how we have to think about that for everybody, and not necessarily make assumptions about their background, even though we know that there are certain things. And I know that the word risk there's different ways you can look at that,
Yeah.
but there's risk factors where we know that certain things are correlated with reduced attendance, for example. But
Sure.
yeah, I'd love for you to talk about that and how
Yeah,
you think about
I
it.
I love this subject. Let me see how I can make it concise. Like here's what we know. So to your point, we know that there's certain risks that lean us towards particular populations. So
Hmm.
there's most of your listeners might know about the Adverse Childhood Experience scale,
Hmm.
right? And so that lots of schools use ACEs as a
Hmm.
score, and when
Yeah.
kids score high on ACEs, we know that we need more intervention in order for them not to become the story, right?
Hmm.
And those risks tend to come with things like poverty. Um, that said, we also know that trauma is personal and perception is important. And so
Hmm.
when we talk about, I use the example of 9/11, where there's good research that says there are people who sort of experienced in New York that trauma, which it certainly was a singular traumatic event, and are okay, right? And then there are people who watched it on TV in California who were really traumatized by that. And and so that's why we say trauma is personal. Like, it's how you internalize it, what that does to your life. It doesn't mean you didn't experience a traumatic event, but there are all sorts of things that indicate how that then manifests. Additionally, when you talked about the resources, sometimes when we're in schools, we look at numbers, and so
Yeah.
we'll say, well,
Yeah.
there's this kid, and they have 10 people in their family who show up for everything that we do, and they have so much support. But sometimes that kid doesn't necessarily feel that support. So let's say you have a child who's struggling with gender identity, and those 10 people have not been able to get to a place where they can recognize that struggle. Then, even though the numbers say that kid has resources, the the brain says, I'm not safe in that environment. I don't have what I need. And so um, thinking about how we um, understand the story behind the behaviors that we're seeing, and what goes into that, is really important. I think in Rochester, in the city of Rochester, where I worked with juvenile diversion, it was not infrequent that I would show up in a school, and people would say, well, this kid needs to be more resilient. And I knew the story of that child, and I would say, well, that kid showed up at your door this morning. That's pretty resilient
Yeah.
given all of the things that, there's no food in the house, there's no parent, they're working on childcare, they couldn't figure out where to sleep the night before, and they actually came to school. To me, we just need to channel that resilience in a way that makes them feel, valued and connected. So I think that stories, that there's the sort of adage that says you don't know what's going on in a person's life when you just look at them, right? So
Hmm.
that really pans out, I think, in the educational world. And sometimes we make correct assumptions, and sometimes we make incorrect assumptions.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
sure that's true. So going to I know you have you published some things about the juvenile diversion specifically and positive youth development. So I'd love for you to talk about some of the research that you've done and just when you're thinking about how do we increase attendance and how do we make kids feel or help kids feel connected. And I know there's a number of ways you can measure this. There's a number of ways once you do measure it, how do you make sense of that information and figure out what to do about it in a way that's meaningful to them?
Yeah.
I love the military example. And I think I can't remember if we talked about this before we started recording or if we did that.
Yeah, no, we did it before, and
We
I'll
did it
make a
before.
segue
Okay, I
between
love
the
that
two
example
jobs.
and maybe we can touch on that again. And you gave another example in a previous conversation we had about a student just figuring out how to understand what's meaningful to the student to draw a connection between what you're doing in school to something that they're thinking about. So yeah, I know there's a lot of different directions we could go with that,
Yeah,
but
let me try and pull that all
yeah,
into a sort of storytelling moment. So so we know that all of us, right? I'm not just going to say kids, like all of us do better when something is meaningful to us,
yeah,
right? And we know that our learning sticks when we can create that meaning. And so things can be meaningful for multiple reasons. We either have a passion for it, we have a natural sort of aptitude, and we see that that's going to further us in some way, or we have a deep connection to someone who inspires us in some way, even if it's a hard thing to do. And I think about, teachers that I've had and my son's had where like I really don't like the subject, but I love the teacher and I'm really invested in the class and I figure out a way through it and they help me do hard things versus something I like and the person there really makes me want to avoid the class, right?
yeah, yeah,
Um, and so one of the things, so I'll start with sort of the first study pre my work at Edmentum in the juvenile diversion program. And in that program, the goal of it was to increase attendance in the Rochester City School District and to keep kids out of placement. And so we used the developmental assets profile as a measure. That's a measure out of the Search Institute. 30 or more years ago, they looked at 40 developmental assets, 20 things internal, 20 things external that had an impact on all the things we want to see happen: student attendance, pro-social behavior, all that kind of stuff, right?
yeah,
And we know that the lower those are, the worse people do. So we thought, okay, well, if we can increase kids' assets, then we could potentially have an increase on their attendance. And so we looked at helping them navigate their communities through community asset navigators. We looked at their social situations and the kinds of things that were going on in their families and whether they needed food and housing and support. And then we looked at their relationships to their schools and their attendance. And we had 3 people that were their core team that worked with them. And then we worked with a variety of support agencies around them. And the idea was that all 3 of those core people could really target building some of these assets. And so in 2018, we published a study that looked at Hillside, where I worked, published a study that looked at how those interventions impacted school attendance, and there was a positive result. Now, subsequently, the Search Institute, who really had that sort of broad brush, did a bunch more research and said, well, one of the things that is most impactful about those assets is developmental relationships. And they created a rubric around helping schools and teachers measure connection to students and what it looks like to be in a positive developmental relationship. And I think ultimately what we realized is that in the program, we learned kids' stories. We learned what their needs were. We created ways for them to find meaning. And I think the story that you were thinking of, you can tell
yeah,
me if I'm correct, is like
right,
I had kids who said to me, I want to be an NBA star.
yep, yeah,
Right. And all of your listeners, they know, like we have kids who say, I want to be a YouTube star. I want to be a
right,
gamer. I want
yeah.
to be
It's
like all these things,
YouTuber,
right?
influencer. I think
And,
back when I was growing up, it was professional athlete or actress, or
Right. And
maybe
and
it still is, but it's different now for this generation.
and one of the appeals of that is like, okay, I feel seen. I feel like I will have a good living, and school, I'm not so great at it. And maybe it's not as important, right? That
Hmm.
really is like the backstory. And so I would say to them, okay, well, one of the first steps that people use going towards the NBA is they play basketball in college, right? Like,
Yeah.
do you know the NCAA has requirements for you to be able to actually play basketball in college, which is different than, in some ways than, 25 years ago,
Yeah.
and much more restrictive. And they would go, well, what do you mean? And I'd say, well, you have to, let's look those up and find out. And they'd go, oh, well, I need this class in order to play in college. And, so suddenly you're like, maybe they don't
Hmm.
like that subject, but you're creating a story for them that leads to a meaningful outcome that
Hmm.
allows people to sort of show up in a different way. And so that program allowed us to both build relationship, to understand their larger eco-cultural niche and story, and to then help them find their spark and create meaning in the steps of that journey. And that was really powerful. And the segue to where I am now, and so that's the second piece of research that
Hmm.
you cited is right. So now I work for a digital company that builds curriculum, and you think, okay, well, how can we have that same impact? And one of the things that we know is lack of attendance happens for a multitude of reasons.
Right.
And uh, in we have actually a research study coming out in July on a school in South Carolina where there's a high population of military families,
Mm.
and there's some struggles with attendance. And in this case, kids are having trouble connecting the things that they know will support them in their career aspirations, which in this case is to follow in the steps of their family and be a part of the military, and how school could potentially help them or not in that. And so the school introduced courseware, which is essentially a flexible full course curriculum, right? And kids now can take their flying lessons, they can do their job stuff during the day, and they can still complete their courseware or their coursework in a way that now becomes part of their story towards their career trajectory, and their attendance has gone up. And so, for me, like both of those stories, whether it's the kids who are trying to stay out of detention or the kids who are going to serve our country potentially, or whatever kid that you're working with, right? The quest is, how do I understand the life that they're living in, their priorities, and then make education meaningful to them? And right, that's what we're doing.
Yeah. That's an
That's
interesting
pretty
example
cool.
with the military, because I wouldn't, you think about the reasons that kids miss school, and I'm sure that people have a number of examples that come to mind, and
Sure.
that's definitely not one that I would have thought of. But how does it, when you're talking about courseware, and I know that there's a lot of conversation around when we're thinking about the way that even the schedule of the school day is structured.
Yeah.
I'm somebody who worked in the schools, and oftentimes, so I was a school SLP, and thinking about the social skills groups or language, things that need to be integrated across the day, things where if you do it in this isolated 20-minute therapy session, it makes no sense. Kids need this particular intervention or support, but the schedule is it's so ingrained in people, and it's really hard to figure out how to give kids what they need and make it flexible
Yeah.
in order for them to still meet their course, do all the courses they need to do within this framework that doesn't necessarily make sense. And I think one example that I can think of is that, so I had a student who, she was, reading was a struggle for her, so she needed intervention, and then she came to speech, but then she wanted to play an instrument. And the only time that they would let me pull her out for speech was during this her music class. So this opportunity that she has to do this other activity that she's interested in, and I have to take her out of it because this is the only time I can wiggle in around that academic time. And I know it's a little bit of a different example, but just another example of how when we think about the scheduling, it can impact what kids are really interested in. So I'm curious about just courseware and how that looked logistically, how you were able to make that happen to allow kids to learn, get their academic work done, but
Yeah.
also explore these other things that they might be interested in or just integrate it more.
Yeah, so I mean, so there are a couple things in that are really interesting. The first, in terms of just the product, is flexible and customizable for every school. So
Mm-hmm.
it's gonna the uh, there's a whole course that a teacher then doesn't have to plan, but can interact with a student
Mm-hmm.
around, and that can create flexible time for
Mm-hmm.
schools depending on how they choose to use it. So that's the example for that particular school. I think it's you know there are a couple of other pieces to that. When I think about the example that you gave, what actually stands out to me is this idea that because we're so busy, and we are so busy, and teachers are so, we want kids to succeed,
Mm-hmm.
and we know that certain interventions are needed for those success. But what happens is we have that list of tasks and we forget there's a person in front of us.
Yeah.
And I'm not judging anybody, right? We have to
Right.
get kids through tests. We have to
Mm-hmm.
do all sorts of kinds of things. And the example that you gave to me just is that moment of saying, like, this is a child who loves music. And maybe that's the thing that keeps them coming to school.
Mm-hmm.
And we've now made them their um, struggle. We've now like there's a whole pushback, and maybe there still is, around identifying students by what we would say is a disability, right? And sometimes that can be empowering because we know the tools that we need to apply
Right.
to help them be
Mm-hmm.
successful, and
Yeah.
sometimes it can be disempowering because we turn it into their story,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And I had a son. I have a son. He's 26. He knows I talk about him. He was diagnosed with ADHD early and sensory integration. Very, very smart kid. Could take AP classes. Struggled in Spanish. Struggled in certain things, and pushed back to school, which was a high performing school, and said, "I'm only going to take the minimum requirements for my language. And while I can take X number of APs, I'm not going to take them all because I also need to wrestle, and I also need to have, music in my life, and I need to be well. I need to be a well person. And if I do all the things you're asking me to do, I'm not going to be able to do that." And so I think, you know, learning about what kids need that keep them engaged and feel meaningful, like that child may have been more engaged in their speech if they
Mm-hmm.
had had music first.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Right? You
Yeah.
you sort of the tone in which you said that, like, you knew that.
Right. Yeah. I know I
And
hated it where I'm like, I hate that I'm taking you
yeah,
right now. And what else always bothered me so much is just the way that it probably made the music teacher feel. Like I hated that where he knew he was never like we had a good relationship, but I always felt bad about that because I'm like, what is this saying about your class that I'm always taking the student out of it? So that
yeah,
I hated that. I'm going to take a quick break here to talk about the School of Clinical Leadership, my program that helps related service providers develop a strategic plan for putting executive functioning support in place on their school teams. So, one of the things that I hope you're taking away from this conversation is the fact that when we're thinking about student support, we of course want to think about the academic supports that we're putting in place, but it's so much more than that. And when we're thinking about skills that are really going to impact academic skills, but are also going to impact a lot of other things that students will be doing in their lives, whether it be vocational settings, social skills, all of those types of things. these are things we really have to consider when we are developing programming that's related to social emotional learning. So it's definitely not something that we can adequately address by doing just a pull-out model and just thinking about what we need to do in our therapy sessions in a 20 to 30-minute block of time. Of course, that's part of what we need to be doing, but there's so much more than that. And that's why I developed the School of Clinical Leadership to help related service providers like speech pathologists, social workers, school counselors, psychologists, OTs, and really anyone else who is in that interventionist role to understand how to navigate all this and really work with their teams to think bigger about how we serve students. To learn more about the program, you can go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership.
Well, there's an interesting, we've skirted this issue of career connected learning, which
Oh,
we're
yeah.
also doing and is so
Right. Yeah.
important. And from an adult perspective, Gallup has done, so many studies on strengths in workforce. And what we know is that when adults work a job where they're in their sort of aptitude, passion, like naturally gifted areas, 80% of the time they're more likely to like love their job and stay in their job and show up for their job and not get sick and all of those things. So if you extrapolate that and you move that to students and you say like, okay, well, if I'm allowing students to also participate in the things that are helping them practice and experience the things that make them feel good and connected and have aptitude rather than pushing them into all the things that they're miserable in most of the time, attendance is going to go up, right? Like
Yeah.
that it's so interesting and a lot of the things that we teach kids, since we don't know what careers they're going to have in 20 years, it's this ability to adapt and think critically and like use learning as a vehicle for that is really the most exciting part of education right now. And so finding that niche that allows kids to learn those skills is pretty cool.
Yeah. And I think this is a good segue to another study that you had mentioned is and being somebody who works in the space of language and literacy, where I know that it's really hard to like something when you struggle with it, and reading can be just such this really fulfilling experience for people who, when you know how to do it, but if you can't do it, it's hard. So there's this emphasis on getting that reading instruction so that you can get to the point that you enjoy it, and then it has this huge impact on your day. And so that's always the struggle that I have with, well, I know that I have these skills that are going to help those other things, but at the same time, I also know that sometimes you need a break. And so where's the balance? And so I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the impact of things like high impact tutoring on attendance and engagement, because I know that you had some things that some work that you've done in that area.
It's so fascinating, and I love this idea of literacy. I don't know if you've ever read the book The Poverty Problem by Horatio Sanchez.
No, but we can put it on the list for listeners.
It's really interesting, and I'm really fascinated in the connection between empathy and literacy and learning. And this is going to cycle us back to that high impact tutoring piece.
Yeah.
And what he's learned is that our ability to read and respond to verbal and nonverbal cues and tone and the impact that has on loving reading and learning language and all of that is really damped down when kids are in a survival mode. So whether that's poverty or trauma or whatever. And so when kids are in that sort of fight, flight, or freeze piece, the brain has to choose how to survive that, and they actually damp down empathy, and that impacts literacy acquisition and learning and love of reading. And so how do you combat that, right? Well, you do that by creating a safer, focused environment where kids can sort of let their guard down and learn all these different things. And so for me, one of the things that's really fascinating, Stanford just released a study in 2024 that students are less likely to be absent during days where they receive high impact tutoring. In fact, by 7%, including kids who miss more than 30 days typically in a year, which equates to like 5 extra days of school, which is great because we know they need that. Now, why, right? Why is that? Now, I don't completely know the answer, but in this discussion, some of the things that stand out to me is like, number one, you're supporting success. You're creating a smaller, like maybe safer environment so that kids can save face and learn essential skills in a way that takes them maybe a little bit more time, but they can create mastery around it. But also to me, it's about that connection. Like you think about it, Edmentum has a high impact tutoring program. And one of the things that we do is we bring kids who are struggling in a thing together through a school district for 6 weeks. And we sort of do, but they really get to know that teacher. That teacher really gets to know the things that are in the way of that struggle. And they're seen. And then then the brain kind of sinks into being able to absorb skills better. I experienced this. I mean, I was not good at math. Poor math gets such a bad rap, right?
I know.
But
Yeah, I have math story too, but we won't get into that now.
yeah. So one of my favorite teachers in high school, and I went to a boarding school that was pretty high succeeding, and I just didn't do well in math. And so they broke algebra 1 up for me over 2 years. And I had a teacher who was very relational, and she also was my European history teacher and would tell things like a soap opera. I mean, it was fascinating, right? But just very relational. And she really broke down skills for me. And I felt very safe and connected in that classroom. And by the end of 2 years, like I could do math. And I did fine in the rest of my math journey. And it was, what she taught me is I could do hard things when I allowed myself to be vulnerable and to, get practice and to learn. And so I think this idea of concentrated, relational, high impact tutoring where we can really help kids do hard things in important ways doesn't surprise me that it increases attendance, because that's what we want, right? We want to be seen and connected and have meaning, and kids want to be successful, right? They want to see how that applies to them. So that's another version of the story of like a way to create meaning.
I think it's that nice balance of working through a learning curve, but if it's going too fast, it's really frustrating, especially if you need something that is at a different pace or more intensive and individualized one-on-one smaller group versus the large group where there's a lot going on. I mean, I can just think of examples of even things that I have to do in my job now where I feel like I'm always the person who's like, when are we going to do training for this? Are you just going to throw us in and expect us to learn through osmosis, or are we going to block in some training in our long-term strategic plan here so that everybody can actually work together effectively? Because I found that speaking of the way that behaviors present themselves when you're dysregulated or frustrated, I can just think of the way that teams work together and how if you have people who have gaps where they need some support, then when you're all trying to work together, it can cause all kinds of things because people get frustrated because they feel like, when you feel like you don't know what you're doing, that could be something that causes you to just get dysregulated on top of whatever else might be going on in your life.
And just like attendance, there's lots of reasons. Like we want to look good in front of our boss. We need to bring home our paycheck because we have a family to support. And so we don't want to feel at risk. Like these stories around the reasons that behavior just happens from our default settings it's interesting because I think we ask kids to do things that we wouldn't necessarily do ourselves. We ask them to be resilient to things or systems or responses that are, just about sort of surviving and trying to, make people around us happy and meet our needs. And some kids have higher demands on that. Some kids have to, work a job. Some kids have lots of things going on in their environments, and the days of sort of showing up and thinking that we can just give people information and pour it into their prefrontal cortex and they're going to block everything else out. We just know now that the brain doesn't work that way. And so, and also, I think it's a really interesting thing and maybe a subject for another time that we also can compare our lives to people in ways that we never could. And we see opportunities in ways that we never could. And so it makes us ask questions about why we're doing something and what's meaningful and how we get there. And so I think parents and students are more engaged in trying to figure out the value of what they're getting in the context of this sort of larger lens. And that means that we have to adapt and think about how do we create that kind of connection and meaning for people. And as we do that, I think we'll be able to increase attendance around things.
Yeah. I had one more thing. I know that
Sure.
you talk a lot about looking at reframing the way that we look at behavior that we see. And so one example that comes to mind that I can think of just from, my experiences. So I was sitting on watching a lived experience panel. So there were autistic adults just sharing their experiences. And this one woman was, in her presentation, she listed out a bunch of feelings words like excited, happy, like things that would describe emotions. And what she said was, she's like, I understand what these words mean because I know that neurotypical people use these things to describe their emotions. And there are things that they use to, talk to themselves or explain to other people how they're feeling to get their needs met. But she's like, none of these things, I don't have any context for these things because I don't experience feelings that way. And she said, I have 3 feelings, and they were more describing physiological responses. I can't remember all of them, but it was like, I'm sparking, I'm fuzzy, or there was one that was like, I'm done. And it was basically her level of alertness. And that's what she uses to communicate to her support network to let them know, I need to go and take a break and recharge, or I'm ready to go. I'm ready to engage with you. And that helps her to just prepare more so that she's not in situations, or she has fewer situations where she's having a meltdown, like out in public, where she knows that there's going to be a lot of things that are going to be overstimulating or things like that. So I'm curious how you think about helping the teachers as well as helping the students have a vocabulary for being able to understand and then ask for what they need when we're seeing some of those behaviors and we don't really know where they're coming from or what's the reason.
Oh my gosh, I just love this question. I'm trying to think about how not to take us into a whole nother podcast.
Yeah, I know. No pressure.
So I'm sure your listeners have listened to Brene Brown talk about the fact that like the more nuanced you can be in articulating your emotion, the better off you are, and that when you can name it, your brain actually moves from the emotional brain to a more connected sort of prefrontal cortex regulated piece. So naming emotions is super important. Now, there are a whole bunch of hurdles in that. So first of all, our generation, so the teachers, that involves a self-awareness that's really important, which you articulated so beautifully in the story of this person who identifies as an autistic adult, right? What they needed was to have self-awareness around their ability, and then a way to communicate that to their support network that worked. And there's a really interesting program for, I mentioned earlier, my son was diagnosed with sensory integration dysfunction, which is it's one of the comorbidities along the autism spectrum. And there's a PT program, physical therapy program called something like how does your engine run? It's the alert program.
Mhm.
And they look at your body as a car engine and the speeds at which you're running. So that was what I thought of when you talked about that, and the ability
Yeah.
to sort of articulate like, okay, I'm revving, my engine is revving right now. How do
Mhm.
I calm my engine down
Yeah.
and regulate? So that's a really helpful and important sort of piece to learning self-awareness, to be able to articulate your needs for that kind of thing. But one of the biggest hurdles I've found in schools where I've talked about this is that adults, and I think Brene does say this, like can only identify 3 emotions accurately in the moment themselves:
That's interesting. I find that
anger,
myself.
sadness, and like excited
Mhm.
or happy. But the nuances of where they come from, like when I say I'm tired, well, are you tired? Are you feeling depressed? Are you disengaged? Are you like the nuances of that? And one of the examples is to your point, really important how we articulate that, because if I say I'm tired and someone says, okay, we'll go take a nap, but really that's going to isolate me more, and I'm depressed and I'm feeling lonely and what I need is connection,
Mhm.
then right there I've created potentially more of a challenge for myself. And so, if we think about the power of emotions to um, connect us to each other, to the joy of reading, like you said, to
Mhm.
right, being able, this language is really important. And I think the place to start with actually is with the adults and the environment,
Mhm.
to help
Yeah.
us build our own self-awareness about like,
Yeah.
you know, that kid really made me mad and I don't want him in my classroom anymore, right? I heard that a lot because I worked with kids who were really good at that.
Mhm.
And really it wasn't making them mad, it was making them afraid. They were
Mhm.
worried for their safety. They were worried for whether they'd have enough support with that kid. They'd worried about the other kids learning that, like, these are such complex things that then cut us off from relationship. And so starting with helping adults articulate emotions, and then helping kids say, you know, you don't, you don't seem yourself today. Tell me more about what's going on. Can you put words to your experience? Does it feel like anything we've read about? Does it, making those connections can really, um, that's a great way to move from a task to a person.
Mhm. Yeah.
And such a great question. And I don't think we are ever going to be perfect at articulating that, no matter how many um, books we read that help us define emotions, because in the moment when our brain takes over, um, we'd have to have had a lot of practice to be able to name it. And that, but being able to have the coping skills to say, I need to calm my engine down so that I can now be more introspective and relate to the person around me as someone who's trying really hard, um, and that I need to better understand, is a great step um, in all of this whole
Yeah.
story that we've talked about today.
Well, and I think the main thing is starting with the adults and helping them create
Yeah.
the modeling and the structure around it, because everybody, we know that everybody can work on this. Everybody probably needs to work on this, but you as the adult are the one that's kind of shaping that and providing the modeling for how to articulate that in that moment. So,
Yeah, one of the
yeah.
most helpful things people told me is nobody can make you feel a particular way,
Yeah.
right? Like
Hmm.
you know, um, why am I feeling a particular way is based on my life story and all the triggers and the things that have happened, and the behavior is just the catalyst for that, right? So
Yeah. Yeah. That's a
sometimes,
good reframe.
yeah, sometimes it's just sort of going like, okay, so what, why is this coming up, and how can I move through that and not make it the other person's issue, because that person needs me to be more even keeled
Hmm.
in this
Yeah.
moment because they're learning.
Hmm. Yeah.
So this is so cool. I mean, we could talk about this all day
I
long.
know. I know. Well, I know that yeah, there's so many different, there's several podcasts that could be had on these topics, but I'd love for you to share where people can learn more about you and some of the work that you've done. And yeah, where can people go to connect with you?
Yeah, so edmentum.com. You can Google that and put my name next to it, and some things will pop up. There's some YouTube things that I've done on understanding the function of behavior. We just put an article out on CTE, and it should be coming out soon. And there's an article that came out in District Administrator on um, chronic absenteeism and connection. Yeah, a bunch of interesting things, and that's the easiest way to find it is just plug Jen Perry in and Edmentum and see what you get.
All right, great. Well, we'll link to some of these things too. I know you shared a few of them with me. So thank you so much for being here with me today.
Well, thank you for doing this podcast. I just love the idea that you're linking all of these kinds of things together on a regular basis. So thank you to your audience for listening and keeping you moving.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for listening. Please be sure to check the show notes for all the links to the resources that we discussed in this conversation, as well as where you can connect with Jen. Also, be sure to check out the School of Clinical Leadership if you want to learn more about how to support students' executive functioning. You can learn more about the program at drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. If you are interested in being a guest on De Facto Leaders, if you have a suggestion for a guest, or if you would like to invite me to collaborate, such as being a guest on your show, you can email me at talktome@drkarenspeech.com. And as always, it helps me so much if you leave me a rating or review wherever you listen to your podcast, and if you share this with your colleagues if you found it useful. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next time.